Okay, welcome everyone to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by the Congress for the New Urbanism. Today we have an authors forum on street design, the second edition, with co-authors John Massengale and Victor Dover. The interviewer moderator is myself, Robert Steuteville. So first, a couple of notes. CNU 35 will be in the Twin Cities of Minnesota June 15th through 18th, 2027. So mark your calendars. And it's never too early to start planning for CNU next year. Go to cnu.org/CNU35 and consider getting CNUA accredited. Sign up for CNUA. The benefits of accreditation provides a marketable credential to employers and clients. CNU accredited professional certificates, cnu.org public member directory listing as CNU accredited, and it's a great refresher course for all things new urbanism. Even if you know this stuff, you'll learn some new things by going through this course again. cnu.org /get involved /get CNU accredited for more information. And I'm looking forward to our conversation today with the co-authors of the second edition of what has become a classic New Urbanist book. We have John Massengale and Victor Dover presenting today. John Massengale, AIA-CNU, is an architect, urbanist, educator, and author in New York City, a fellow of CNU Seaside Institute, and Create Streets. He has served on the board of CNU, and he was a founding chair of both CNU New York and CNU NYC. He has taught architecture and urbanism studios at the University of Notre Dame, Georgia Tech, the ICAA, the Swedish Royal Technical Institute, and the University of Miami. And he's a licensed architect in New York State. Victor Dover is founding principal and principal in charge of Dover Cole and Partners. He is nationally recognized as an innovator in city planning and design, having led more than 200 charrettes. I'm Rob Steuteville, editor of CNU Public Square. The book is Street Design, The Secret to Great Cities and Towns, the second edition. First of all, congratulations, John and Victor, on this book. It is really tremendous and a big improvement over what was already a great book. The first edition of Street Design, I think it should be widely read by not just urban designers, but city planners and public officials, and especially traffic engineers. In the perfect world, every traffic engineer would read this book at gunpoint if necessary. It would greatly broaden their horizons. And it is the only book on streets where you get a limerick. There is an extensive discussion of Nantucket, the main street in Nantucket, which I now have to go visit. It's the island off of Massachusetts, and there is a picture of a street with the roots spilling over into the pavement, taking up some of the pavement space in a way that would probably upset traffic engineers. And accompanied by this text, there once was a tree in Nantucket with none of its roots in a bucket. That can't be, said the state DOT, but no car has ever yet struck it. So with that, I'm going to pass this along to Victor Dover, and he's going to start. Oh, I should mention that there's going to be a discussion after the presentations and then a Q&A from the audience, so please use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask your questions as they occur to you. You can start putting them in as soon as you want.
Well, thanks, Rob, for that. I have to say, like many of my new urbanist friends, I am surrounded by books at home and in the studio. Books are just really important to us. And a few books in particular made such a difference to us as young pups in architecture and urban design. One of them for me is Ed Bacon's The Design of Cities, which you keep a treasured first edition right on the shelf behind me. And so we kind of pay homage to that with the street design book. The first sentence is, the design of cities begins with the design of streets. But I want to say thanks for having an authors forum, because I've enjoyed the many episodes where you've had people come on and talk about their books, and also because the books have become so important as transmissions or communication devices for us within the New Urbanist movement. So anyway, hopefully people will find this one useful. If nothing else, let us suggest you get one, use it as a doorstop, get bored one day, flip through it. You'll find a picture in there that means something to you. As a practitioner and a teacher, I gradually arrived at the conclusion that street design was the one thing we could least afford to get wrong. And it's the one thing we most often got wrong. So about a decade ago, my co-author, John Massengale, who Rob mentioned is from New York, and I came out with our book on street design. And we researched and visited many hundreds of streets around the globe and called upon some of our most trusted colleagues also to contribute case studies about what they thought was important. And, the new expanded, totally revised second edition has this foreword by Carlos Moreno and an afterword by Liz Plater-Zyber, and is available now. We have this big inheritance. Our inheritance after 3,500 years of city building includes all kinds of streets that have proven adaptable and enduring and relevant. You go from China to Rome, there are these measurable, repeatable patterns. Brooklyn, Bologna, there are these building to street relationships. They're identifiable and replicable. And so we were provoked a bit, both by our understanding of historical streets, which we talk a lot about in the book, in the chapter on historic streets, and by the changes that were taking place around the world, especially provoked by the fact that while we were making great progress in the 20-teens, American progress seems to have slowed or even stalled, and the progress in the European capitals has accelerated. So we thought, well, okay, let's go back to the book, add material. We, of course, built that around items that were in the first book. After we measured and photographed and argued about so many streets, we arrived at this core understanding that they had to have the things that are required to be streets where people want to be. And that means they have to be shaped with a necessary degree of spatial enclosure, like a public room, where the vertical parts like buildings and trees are the walls. And second, they had to be comfortable, designed around the climate to make us, a fragile species, feel welcome there, throughout the seasons. Third, the streets where people want to be are the ones that go somewhere, facilitate exploring in a permeable network. Fourth, they have to be safe, including safety for motorists when we share space with them, including the safety that comes from what Jane Jacobs called eyes on the street. And so, and they have to be memorable. And so looking at what we could add to the new book, there are many new case studies in the book. There's quite a lot of new special material contributions by special artists, new examples. And I'll just talk about what some of those are. One of them is a new case study on the history of the streets of Tel Aviv. They came from Patrick Getty's plan for Tel Aviv. Yodin Rafik from University in Israel wrote this case study. Robin Crowder made this great map showing the Getty's plan. Getty started us down a road where he differentiated the menu of streets from what he called the main ways, which are these mostly north-south streets that are fairly continuous, and what he called the home ways, which were the streets that go shorter distances, typically east-west, and they have a lot more T-junctions and are terminated, have shorter blocks. So this combination of the high streets and the big streets and the little streets was a starter kit for what eventually became too limited a menu in streets. In Toulouse, you don't usually think of Toulouse, France as like the poster child city for street design, and yet Nicholas Boyd-Smith from Create Streets wrote a very compelling story for the book about all that's changed in Toulouse. Toulouse embodies the idea we introduced in the first edition and continue in the second, that simple, understated elegance is the way to go, that a simple color palette, not necessarily overly elaborate street, was the right kind of street in many cases. And that got us thinking about pavements. Robin Williams from the Savannah College of Art and Design wrote a history of pavement. Yes, it's actually quite interesting. You should check it out, including a study of what cities did what when as they moved from wood blocks to brick streets, pavement, asphalt pavement, and so on. My favorite photograph from that essay is from 1974 in Wilmington, North Carolina, where the hippies are taking matters in their own hands and got out and started removing the asphalt from their historic brick streets. After the first edition came out, we had made the point that that so-called functional classification into a limited menu of arterial, collector, and local streets just won't cut it. So Mayor Jerry Moyo of West Palm Beach asked us to redesign the main street in West Palm Beach. And we said to do that, we had to look beyond functional classification. Clematis Street is the historic main street, and like many of them, it got widened and disfigured. There was a round of improvement, which made a big difference, but the portion of the street space devoted to people and walking and seating and trees was still far too meager. So here's a look at how the new Clematis Street looks. It's shaded and skinny and curbless and slow and safe. The aerial view kind of shows how much more of the street space is devoted to people and landscape and dining and so forth, and how much less is devoted to moving and storing cars. It turned out that there are cars and trolleys circulating when they want that, but many times it's an open street that is closed to cars, the whole right of way open to people. So it turns out to be an adaptable street used different ways at different times. That inspired their Downtown Development Authority to commission a pattern book for flexible use of the public realm, guiding the various ways to reduce or remove cars from downtown streets and take advantage of the curbless cross sections and so on. That turned out to be really important during the pandemic when the businesses needed to move activities once found only inside buildings to the outside. We introduced another list of 10 ingredients for car optional neighborhoods in the second edition. Most of those are pretty low-tech ideas, like plant street trees, small blocks. But the most important one is designing slow, safe, highly walkable, bikeable streets. And so I'm curious any feedback people have about their idea of what the car optional neighborhood and whether our ingredient list is the right recipe. And that's all that said, that rich, varied inheritance of all the different kinds of streets we talk about in the historic chapter was undercut about 80 years ago by traffic engineer standards. In the world of streets, this is boiled down to just three: the arterial, collector, and the local road. That same system recognized only two contexts, if you can call it two: the rural, by which they meant suburban, and the urbanizing, by which they also meant suburban. So you had the arterial, the local, the collector, and the arterial, all built around the assumption that people are expected to drive, usually alone, everywhere, every time, for everything. And so the worlds of city planning and transportation engineering and infrastructure funding are all retooled around that assumption. So in the second edition, we introduced another menu, a better menu. We call it the new catalog of 10 essential street types. This is in the spirit of observing and distilling and then documenting. This new catalog covers a wide range of types. Call it a starter kit, and many variations on them. We start with the rarest but most sensitive cases, like the widest streets that serve a citywide or regional function, but still have to serve as dignified addresses, like grand boulevards and avenues, promenades. And then we work our way down to more ordinary or narrower streets, main streets, garden streets, pedestrian-only streets, and drives, parkways. Now, that catalog is illustrated with a series of images of computer models built by Robin Crowder here in our office. And then for each of the street types in the catalog, we created a detailed computer model of the basic conditions of the type. We use those to make illustrations of 28 variations. That's what I'm calling the starter kit. And since then, we've been using the same models to create animations. So readers can link from the ebook or visit street.design, that's the website, street.design, to see the street from more angles, get an idea how it works. So we started with, for example, the big but rare. We modeled a classic multi-lane, multi-way boulevard as evolved by the Parisians, and then in Brooklyn by Olmsted. And for some of those, we start with the trees turned on, so you can see how Olmsted and Haussmann saw these as park-like green corridors. And then we take the streets off so you can see the pattern on the ground plane. The the genius of the multi-way boulevards, and Alan Jacobs and Elizabeth McDonald pointed this out in their books, is the ability to reconcile through-going movement with local life. So this is a big, rare, hardworking street. We also look at promenade streets like the Commonwealth Avenue pattern in Boston, the Rambla pattern in Barcelona. And then we looked at some everyday streets too, like main streets or high streets. This is a cousin to the Clematis Street example that I showed a moment ago. Wide sidewalks, tad of on-street parking, one lane in each direction. And so here, updating from the way we might have drawn it in the early 2000s as a curbless street. We then start thinking about how part of the mission is to harness street design and address making in the service of gentle densification. So we illustrate row house streets and village streets. This one's a fun one for a street for a small village or hamlet that's an asymmetrical street needed in northern climate. Allows the occasional lean-in tree that Unwin prescribed. And that allows for south-facing garden, for example. So you also, on this one, see the curbs and building faces and rights-of-way lines that depart from necessarily being parallel from one another. So in addition to asymmetrical, it's more adjusted rather than what John has called the endless section that looks like it was rolled out in a steel mill, like a steel beam, but rather a section that changes as you move along. Here's a car-free green street that's like a classic residential street in the streetcar suburbs. Since the vehicles are served by alleys behind the houses anyway, on the street side, all the asphalt is replaced with a linear green. That was realized at Baldwin Park in Florida. If you haven't seen Baldwin Park, it'd be worth the trip just to see that example. So we look at pedestrian-only streets, mid-block arcades, tiny laneway passages, step streets, the English garden streets, just basically trying to illustrate how many variations are possible. The staple American garden street provides an example of that, which I'll end on. This is for a neighborhood we designed for Rogers, Arkansas. We needed a street that could serve as the natural connection to the regional trail system. So we created a version of the American garden street that has 1, 2, 3 tree lines instead of just two. And then we used one of those pairs to create an LA for the trail. So this is kind of an illustration of the idea of variations on the theme. And so when you're on the ground, you can see how the starter kit on the catalog might be used to unleash 1,000 more variations, anywhere that the experience of place matters, like in this example. So the catalog wraps up with 2 green types at the end of the edge of the neighborhood and beyond. Drives, according to Lexicon, that's a street with buildings on one side and a park or waterfront on the other, is one of those types. The classic example of a drive is Riverside Drive in Manhattan. John has written what will come to be known as the definitive design history of this great street, which I'm expecting he will talk to you about momentarily. So take a look at the street.design website. You can find the animations there, even if you don't have the book yet. And then I hope people listening in will take the book to their meeting with the Transpocracy and then let us know how they're using the book. Rob? How'd that stream?
So, are you now seeing me?
Yep, it's got the book cover, John.
So, thank you, Victor. Thank you, Rob, and thank you all for joining us. I have to say, Victor and I started working on the first edition in 2010, and we've both read all the Word docs, PDFs, InDesign files for the 2 editions for probably thousands of times. And yet, I just learned something from Victor's presentation. It's really been a great collaboration, and it's even better the second time around. So let's get started. This is the new page 1, a lot like the old page 1, but we start with an interesting quote from Jane Jacobs, and we've added new case studies, new guest authors, new sections, as Victor said, and we have more about early new urbanism and more about how we experience cities, how urban designers think differently than traffic engineers, and of course they control our streets, And we talked some about our own experiences as urban designers and street whisperers. Victor wrote a section called My Miami, and I wrote My Manhattan. So the green background means you're looking at a page from the first edition. The new edition has blue pages and blue headings. And while we were writing the new book, a group in New York called the Institute for Public Design held what they called a Public Ideas Competition. And Dover Cole and I made a few entries with the help of James Doherty and Zeke Bermel. And like this idea for Jane Jacobs Square, a few blocks from Jane's own house on Hudson Street. Something else to know is that Jane said people walking on the street don't like long, unterminated vistas. In Death and Life, she wrote that one way to deal with the problem is to add trees, which we did here. After the first edition came out, I made some new drawings and I turned the idea into a New York Times op-ed. And we had a lot of time on our hands during the pandemic. As I said, we had a lot of time on our hands during COVID. I also worked on a series of proposals and counter proposals for New York streets that I called Slow New York. Some of them for groups like Transportation Alternatives and the Financial District Neighborhood Association, FDNA. What you're seeing now is more or less the view from my office, more or less because it's about 15 stories higher than my office. And the idea for this idea for the Brooklyn Bridge was part of a plan I worked on for FDNA and Borough Happold. The bridge is just out of view at the top of the slide, and the spaghetti streets in the center are off-ramps built by Robert Moses. City Hall Park is at the bottom center of the photo, and McKinley & White's great New York Municipal Building is the tower on the upper left. Before Moses tore down dozens of blocks of old New York and rearranged streets for traffic flow, Chambers Street ran through the municipal building. Now the bridge is more like a fire hose, pouring enormous numbers of impatient, angry drivers into New York City's new Lower Manhattan congestion zone. Underneath the municipal building are several subway lines. You come up out of the subway under beautiful Guastavino domes and a magnificent colonnade, only to run into a constant stream of cars going to and from the bridge that cuts you off for both the park and all of Lower Manhattan to the south. My original idea was to use the ramps to divert all the traffic back to the East River Drive, but even better than diverting the traffic would be removing it. Cars driving into Manhattan from the west have 3 ways to cross the Hudson, but 16 ways across the East River. The Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, the Manhattan Bridge, and the Williamsburg Bridge are all nearby, and nowhere in New York has better subway service than City Hall and Wall Street. Now that we have the congestion zone in this part of the city, we don't need so many ways in. This is the FDNA plan called Make Way for Lower Manhattan. City Hall and the Brooklyn Bridge are at the top. Making the bridge car-free would connect a beautiful park and a great route for walking and biking from Brooklyn to Lower Manhattan, the Financial District, Ground Zero, and the great New York Harbor. The Financial District, of course, is where New York was founded by the Dutch in 1624, when it was called New Amsterdam. Almost 10 years ago, Mayor de Blasio made the FDNA plan part of his Green New Deal and gave a $500,000 grant for a pilot project. But against the wishes of small business in the area and the 75,000 plus who now live in the area outlined above, a local group that is a local important business group killed the plan, calling it anti-car. In fact, if the plan goes through under the Mamdani administration, it will make driving easier because there will be fewer drivers crowding onto the tiny old streets. Wayfinding maps will open the zone to pedestrians and tourists, who don't know where to go after leaving ground zero. You can find much more information by searching for Make Way for Lower Manhattan. My Slow New York website is at slownewyork.city. At the other end of the bridge in Brooklyn, there are more Moses-built ramps connecting to the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, a highway built by Moses that is falling apart. This two-level cantilever underneath the Brooklyn Heights Promenade is the section of the highway most in danger of collapse. And as I wrote in the Daily News op-ed, there are better ways to spend $10 billion than rebuilding the BQE. If the Brooklyn Bridge is a fire hose pumping traffic into the lower Manhattan congestion zone, the BQE is the fire hydrant at the end of the hose. The highway also creates an asthma belt across Brooklyn and Queens. They say the first three rules of real estate are location, location, location. Top left in the photo is Brooklyn Heights. Bottom right is Dumbo, an acronym that stands for Down Under the Manhattan and Brooklyn Overpass. Out of view on the left, at the eastern end of Walt Whitman Park and Cadman Plaza is Brooklyn's Borough Hall and other borough buildings and courthouses. Removing the ramps means the park can be restored. Valuable city-owned land would be available for affordable housing, and the journey from the Brooklyn Civic Center to New York City Hall Park across the beautiful Brooklyn Bridge would be one of the greatest places in New York. The southern side of the bridge, which could be reserved for people on foot, has great views of the harbor and lower Manhattan. The northern side could be for wheeled vehicles, and the raised portion in between, which is now where all people walking and biking go without nearly enough room, would become a quieter place with room for seating, food carts, and space around the piers. It would be the greatest tourist attraction in New York City, as well as an enormously popular route for commuters from Brooklyn to Manhattan. American urbanists who work on this kind of project all hear comments along the lines of, "We're not Amsterdam." Well, as I mentioned, this was New Amsterdam, with streets laid out by Dutch people in the 17th century. Streets are made for cars, drivers say, but this view of Broad Street shows how we lived in New York in the early 20th century, before organized motordom took over even the densest and most walkable American city with the best mass transit in North America. There is no better place for a slow zone in the entire country. Most of the streets are already slow without many cars. Although I should say I shot this photo on a Sunday morning and that on a weekday there are lots of parked cars. At the end of the street is McKimmey & White's New York Municipal Building, where we started. The trees in the photo are at the bottom of Brooklyn Bridge. This new slow zone would connect all the people coming off the Brooklyn Bridge with the financial district and the New York Battery at the bottom of the island. You can tell it's a new urban street because there's a happy dachshund on it. People love this image, and maybe something good will happen here. So 2 years after Victor and I finished the first edition, my wife and I moved to Riverside Drive. At first she said, "We've moved to the suburbs, upstate New York." That sounds strange to anyone who's not from New York, but what she meant was that it's quieter than where we had lived on the Upper East Side, which is true, and that we no longer lived a 5-minute walk from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she could go whenever she wanted to take a long or short break from work. The Frick was nearby too, and a great library in Central Park, the greatest place in New York. Now, Riverside Park is on the left. In particular, we are looking in what is known as the Bowl, and we will come back to this. In 1873, while he was designing Central Park, Frederick Law Olmsted landed the job of designing what was then called Riverside Avenue along the Hudson River on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. In 1875, it was still mainly farmland and virgin forest, and the city wanted a boulevard along the river to promote development. Notice that Olmsted's plan shows 12th Avenue to the west along the river, where the New York Central tracks and many piers stood. This is a view of Edgar Allan Poe's house at 84th and Broadway in 1879. George Washington had become the first president of the United States 100 years earlier in 1779. His inauguration was at the federal Capitol on Wall Street, at the head of Broad Street, which we saw earlier. In 1879, the Brooklyn Bridge was still under construction. Before Olmsted was hired, New York City had tried a few ideas for simply extending the Manhattan grid to the west. But above 59th Street, the southern border of Central Park, Manhattan becomes hilly, particularly on the west side. Olmsted proposed to the city that the land for the drive and the land for the park be looked at together, so that the drive could follow the contours of the hills and thereby avoid a lot of expensive regrading. His design ingeniously limited grades to 1 in 27 for the horse-drawn carriages of the time. That's Grant's tomb at the top right. Originally, the drive made a loop around the monument, just short of a large ravine or valley at 125th Street in Harlem. You can see railroad tracks along the river and a pier in the distance, and farther south there were many more piers. Before the subway, the railroad and the ferries were the transportation from Lower Manhattan. The smoke from the coal-burning trains was another reason Olmsted didn't like the park. But let's go down to the other end of the drive, which starts at West 72nd Street, one of the wide Manhattan cross streets that typically come every 8 to 10 blocks, like 42nd Street, 96th Street, and 125th Street. 72nd is the only cross street that runs through Olmsted Central Park at ground level, rather than in a transverse cut that is lower than the parkland. As you can see, the ground at the beginning of Riverside is relatively flat. You'll also see the Henry Hudson Parkway, which Moses built in 1935. Part of the genius of Olmsted's design is the way he responded to context. At the southern end, a wide plateau borders a section of the drive, which is similar to a normal city street facing a park, with sidewalks on both sides and urban buildings on one side. But in less than 200 feet, the sidewalk on the park side of the drive becomes a wide promenade with benches that slowly move away from the street and into the park. For traffic engineers, the devil is in the details. Because their manuals have formulaic one-size-fits-all sections, they like to apply everywhere, regardless of context. Cities, towns, and suburbia and exurbia all get the same streets. Retrofitting those sections into cities can be devilishly difficult, but for urban designers, God is in the details. That's especially true on Riverside Drive, which constantly changes. In this view, the sidewalk is slowly moving away from the street and becoming a promenade in the park. You can see that in another 200 feet, the promenade goes down into the park, and by the time you get to 76th Street, the promenade and the street are completely separate. On the street, the sidewalk is only on the city side of the street where the buildings are. By the way, I took these photos early in the spring, and even on a gray day, the bright green of the spring leaves really pop. West 79th Street is another of the wide streets that goes through Central Park to the Upper East Side in one of the transverse cuts designed by Olmsted. Here at Riverside, the east-west street connects to the parkway dividing the park. For the pedestrian walking north, the promenade splits into two parts. One part goes down into the park while the other runs along a retaining wall that becomes higher and higher above the park. At 83rd Street, a large outcropping known as Mount Tom extends from Riverside Drive. Before the park was built, a melancholic Edgar Allan Poe used to hang out there, pondering his stories in life. Here's a winter sunset on the Riverside Park Esplanade that Robert Moses built above the train tracks in 1935, by which time all the trains were electrified. Riverside Drive continues uphill, rising to more than 50 feet above the Esplanade, which is perhaps 40 feet above the river. High above the Esplanade, the promenade widens into a plaza, with benches and a ramp down to the river. The Soldiers and Sailors Monument marks the highest point between 72nd Street and 90th Street, where the drive curves around the bowl and starts downhill to a natural ravine at 96th Street. This is the promenade above the bowl before the drive heads down the hill. And here's the bowl in the winter. and a section through the bowl drawn by Robin Crowder. Looking south shows the train tracks under the Esplanade, and then, unfortunately, the Henry Hudson Parkway that Moses built along the Hudson, giving it the place of honor. Most of the land west of the tracks is landfill Moses created. This is a view looking north from 96th Street before Moses's 1935 West Side Improvement Plan. 96th is another of the wide cross streets that crosses the Central Park. And there's a natural ravine and inlet at 96th Street. Riverside Park crosses it on a wide bridge. The drive goes downhill from the Soldiers and Sailors Monument and then heads uphill again after the bridge. Notice that Riverside Drive goes left and uphill at 97, while what Olmsted called the local road goes up to the right. Olmsted used the traditional design principle that says changes in direction should come where there is also a change in topography. I live in one of the buildings on the right. The grassy area between the main drive and the local road is one of the islands that absorbs some of the steepest grades while still giving the buildings access to the street. The islands are all planted today, and they also have more monuments. Once upon a time, as seen in this photo, they were also the front yards for the buildings. 96th Street is at the center of the photo. Below Riverside Drive, which is actually to the west, is the Henry Hudson Parkway. On-ramps and exits connect to Riverside Drive at 96. And to each side, you can see the islands between the main drive and the local roads. In the book, we presented some ideas for greening the bridge and a pleasant place to walk. And this view from an SUV also shows the scene outside my front door. Drivers get off the Henry Hudson Parkway, which today is more of a substandard highway than a parkway, and zoom up my hill, still in the suburban driving mode. On the left, you see the retaining wall the DOT built with a chain link fence that separates the park from the street. For the shared space, we follow the Mondelbaan rule that says less is more and safer. Mondelbaan was a Dutch traffic engineer who might be called the father of modern shared space in the Netherlands. In this redesign, the chain link fence is gone, the retaining wall shelf holds a stone wall, new entrances go into the park, and a continuous sidewalk at 99th Street lets drivers know they're entering a different type of street. Parks Department regulations passed a decade ago encourages more entrances into the park. At the top of the hill is the beautiful Fireman's Memorial, which has become one of my favorite monuments in the world. On the park side is this beautiful calming space where people hang out at different times of the day. The memorial sits on axis with 100th Street and defines the edge of the local road. And here it is on 9/11, when hundreds of firemen gather to remember the fallen. The toll in their numbers on 9/11 was terrible as they ran full speed into the burning towers. On the day, the name of every fireman who died is read and then a bell is rung. It's quite a moving ceremony. Here's another section. This is through the memorial, looking north. As you can see, there's a wide tunnel under the highway where the cars exit the highway and pedestrians walk to the river, and you see Amtrak under the Esplanade. This is a photo from 1935 or so that shows how Moses rebuilt the waterfront. The West Side Improvement Plan built parks and a parkway from 72nd Street to the tip of Manhattan. Here's an aerial view looking north from my island before Moses. And notice how the islands widen and narrow as the topography changes. On the left, you can see an unpaved bridle trail. The island is narrow at West 106th Street, where steps rise to the local road. Cars on 106th Street go 4 blocks north to get down to the drive. And now we're just going to rush up to the end taking a look at the way that Riverside Drive changes as it goes. On the right, you see where the bridle trail was, which is really a wonderful section. On the left, you have the drop down to the park, so you're looking into the trees. Then you have the promenade, and then you have the old bridle trail space. Of course, it changes constantly since there are so many trees. Here's another view looking at, you see how you're at the top of the trees, looking across to New Jersey. Here it is in late spring, in the winter, at dusk, getting up towards Columbia. Columbia is the main entrance to Columbia University's at 116th Street. I am lucky enough to be a free Columbia student, so I walk this practically every day. Another view up by Columbia. This is where Riverside and 116th come together, and it turns and goes up the hill to Grant's Tomb. We'll close with for those of you old enough, Groucho Marx had a program called You Bet Your Life. And one of his favorite questions, which was, how many people are buried at Grant's Tomb? He would ask contestants over and over, so the contestants he liked could get the right answer. The right answer being 0, because President and Mrs. Grant lie in above ground sarcophagi. They're not buried. But this is where the original drive ended, in a loop around Grant's Tomb. And this is where we will end. Thank you. Back to you, Rob.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Victor, were you presenting more slides after this, or is this?
No, that's it. It does fall to me to wrap by shining another bright spotlight on Robin Crowder, who assisted me and John, which is, trouble enough as it is by itself. For more than 4 years to get the second edition done, she tracked every picture and helped research every feature and built all those models and just on and on and on, many tasks. My daughter, Lee Dover, graphic designer and filmmaker here, turned Robin's models into animations so we could put them on the website. So it was a big team effort from our contributors and from our coworkers and from our colleagues at Wiley. So I'd like to make sure to point that out.
I wanted to remind everybody, please put your questions into the Q&A. And in the meantime, we're going to have a little bit of discussion among ourselves. There was a question, though, that was asked about whether this focuses so much on the history of New York City. And I wanted to say that the book really is a tour of some of the great streets throughout the world. And I now have a list, after reading the book, of a lot of places I want to visit, a lot of streets that I want to visit around the world. So I wanted to ask you, did you intend this book as a kind of a travel guide for urbanism nerds? And what are the streets most important for urbanists to visit?
John, you want to start?
Yeah.
So we started this in the first edition. We only wrote about streets that one of us had visited. And we also got a travel grant from Richard Driehaus, and we went to see a lot of streets together. And so, the first book seemed a little less personal than the second, but actually it was quite personal because it was our own favorite streets. We also surveyed our colleagues and friends, and those were some of the streets we went to see. And then we got people like Johnny Longo to write some guest essays, and Andres Duani, and then in the second edition we got more of that. Victor.
Old atlases like those big ones you had in your school library would sometimes have an appendix or accompanying volume called the Gazetteer, and it was like a list of important places that you would use to cross-reference back and forth to the maps. And when we started the first edition, we thought we can't include all the case studies we need here. They won't all fit. And so we started a long list. And then eventually the book just got fatter and fatter, and we included most of them, and many more. One of the things we did was we went back to see streets that we knew as students, or we had seen 20 years earlier, to see how they had changed. And some of the streets that we wrote about in the first edition, we were able to revisit for the second, and see how they were evolving. So it was a kind of thread through time also. The question about New York, there is a ton of stuff about New York in the book, and thankfully so, because it's an American story, and highly relevant. Like, you'll discover there's a lot of transferable lessons. Just now, some of the New Yorkers don't like the stories from elsewhere, the old not invented here syndrome that we sometimes accuse New Yorkers of. But I would think that the people from the rest of the country are going to find lots of stories in New York about things being tried there, experimented with, sometimes perfected, that turned out to be useful in many other places. That said, there are tons of examples from elsewhere. For our viewers from Washington, D.C., for example, there's an extensive discussion about the parkway system that was implemented during the City Beautiful period, and in our section on parkways. So Washington figures really prominently into that, just as much as New York. And I think the last bit I'll say about that is that while John and I are both very optimistic in general, and we're always looking toward what could be next and better, we also let our frustrations boil over in a place or two with the status quo, and that's often directed at our local transportation agencies. So John provides both praise and blunt critique for the New York transportation officials. He wrote a section toward the back of the book called My Manhattan. So for those who do want to know about New York, read that section anyway. Yeah, all should. I wrote a section called My Miami, which is about our experiences here in Miami-Dade, and I kind of let loose on our Department of Transportation and Public Works here. So you will find stuff that is mirrored between the New York examples and the examples from around the world.
Rob, just one quick thing. Implied in the first edition was the importance of experience. It's much more blatant in the second edition. We say the design of cities begins with the design of streets. And then we actually say, here are the things that influenced us as we were growing up that really taught us a lot about streets and cities.
I think the impression that I got was that it was more than begins with the design of streets, but the book sort of makes the case that the design of cities is the design of streets. I don't know how you feel about
I'll take a crack at that. There's a saying which I love, which is that streets are the slowest of human institutions to change. So once you lay a street down in a spot on a map, it tends to stay right there for hundreds or thousands of years. Now, some get abandoned, some get moved, some get resized. Most of them get rebuilt generation by generation above and below ground. They tend to stay right where they are. So the layout of the streets in a town, the initial pattern or framework of blocks and streets, that becomes the armature around which three-dimensional urbanism matures, is incredibly important. And it stays important. Like, it stays with the life of the city as the city evolves, or town or village, whatever it is. And if the street pattern is immature or ineffective, so will the urbanism be.
I'm going to get to a question that was asked. Once again, put in questions on the Q&A. What would be the most effective way to bring about changes in the aggregate across many separate municipalities throughout the United States? Change the culture of Americans so they demand more of their cities and towns, implement larger mandates and preemption measures at the county or state levels, change the culture of elected holders so that they listen to this new crop of planners. What's the most effective way?
You want to start, John?
I was just thinking, do you want to start, Victor? You know,
So I will respond to one phrase in there, the culture in America. That seems way off. First of all, we have at least 9 nations in North America, maybe a dozen. And within our regions, we have many, many, many subcultures, neighborhood by neighborhood, street by street. So to refer to it as a single thing, I think the person who wrote that was probably thinking autocentric, car-based culture, like when Dick Cheney was asked about climate change and SUVs, and he said the American lifestyle is not on the table for negotiation. That implies that the American culture is car-based and car-brained and car permanent. And we love cars. We spend a lot of time in the book explaining that we don't hate cars. We're not car-hating horse and buggy planners, but we drive too much and we are overly dependent on them. So yeah, that should be on the table for negotiation. Now, as far as that short list of strategies, I like the one of focusing on elected officials, and I'll tell you why. Mayor Riley in Charleston said that the mayors and other elected officials are the chief urban designers of their cities. Now, the first choice on the menu was get more voters on board to feel this way, so that they'll elect elected officials who believe good streets matter. It's both. The old business saying, keep your boss's boss off your boss's back. Well, if our elected officials are running the show and the chief urban designers of their cities, their bosses are the voters. So sure, both. And I think both of those are probably way more effective than top-down command and control, Soviet centralized preemption from the states. Not that there isn't some usefulness for that or a place for deregulation where it's run amok, but on the street, that's where the people need to be convinced. All right, John, I stalled, so you had time to think about it.
You know, we changed the organization of the second edition a bit. We used to have 6 chapters, and we had a chapter on new streets, a chapter on rebuilt streets, and we combined those. So we now have this very clear structure of there's the introduction, there's old streets, then there's a sort of palette change of theory and a few bigger issues. And then we go to the rebuilt and new streets. And finally, we wrote a basically new final chapter called Cruise Streets. We were coming out of COVID, and it seemed like, we were going to have so many changes in American streets, especially here in New York City, where we had Jeanette Sadiq-Khan making big changes. And that was now 20 years ago, and the New York City DOT does almost nothing today that they didn't do in Jeanette's first couple of years. And they have not moved on on the whole, obviously on the whole, they have not moved on from what you might call tactical urbanism and some better traffic engineered streets to doing what Europe is doing, which is really rebuilding their cities and putting people first. And there is no American city that's doing that. And the mayors or the voters or somebody has to figure out how to change the traffic engineering profession, because they control our streets. They have the budget, they have the control, and they are very slow to change.
So you spend a lot of time in this book on street types, and it made me think of the whole conversation around missing middle housing, that these could be described as the missing street types, that they completely, they were all common before World War II, and then they just completely disappeared from the design of our cities. How did these street types go missing, and how do you reintroduce them more broadly across America? Either one?
Victor, you're out in the field more than I am.
One skirmish at a time. When you actually get asked to look at a corridor, or you're trying to turn the lights back on in a historic neighborhood, in need of revitalization. There's not usually going to be some kind of academic navel-gazing discussion about street type. That's going to happen when you get to this moment when someone is checking what's proposed against whatever their standard is. And if they're from the sort of old school one-size-fits-all arterial collector local, and by the way, those are often all close to the same, then that's when you're going to have a discussion about street type. And so we've attempted here to reintroduce the variety, not because now this list is the list, but rather because this starter kit is the start of 1,000 variations. Because we need to run more experiments, not fewer. We need to give proper field testing to a variety of streets, not just the ones that are usually invoked because it is implied by the manuals that they'll be safe, and actually in many cases they aren't even that. So I hope that answers. We just feel like broadening the discussion rather than narrowing it down. And you can pick any subtopic. It could be about bike accommodation or accessibility for persons in wheelchairs or the sight impaired, or the topic of entertaining streets, visitor industry places, crime prevention. Just narrow in on any piece of it that you want. Architectural style. For every one of those, there is a whole set of bad habits that have to be undone in order to build new urbanism. And that's kind of the challenge of new urbanism, not just streets.
There's a question. I noticed that many of the successful street examples also had classical architecture and traditional planning patterns. How much do you think the surrounding architecture, landscaping, and urban form contribute to the success of the street itself? John?
So there's a famous Rem Koolhaas quote. Rem is a genius. There's a famous Rem Koolhaas quote that says, basically, our buildings don't add up to a city. And that has been a problem with modernism. Not that you cannot make streets with modernism, but it hasn't been done much. The Starchitect buildings are objects. The shopping centers are objects, and that's why so many of our examples show traditional and classical buildings. Also, I guess new urbanism had the experience of, it was market-based, and it began outside the cities pretty much, and the developers were saying our clients want traditional architecture.
I would say that although we titled the book Street Design, lots of people come to this discussion assuming that means just the stuff that's in the public right of way or just the stuff that's between the curbs, and we say no, the whole ensemble, the buildings and the building to street relationships, the landscape, the adjacent land uses, the whole urban design ensemble, including the space between the buildings, is one thing. And since it's done asynchronously, the master plan for the town, probably aligning that street, will probably be done at one stage. The design details of the street construction within the right of way, like where the curbs go and where the trees are planted or whatever, is going to happen another time, later on, maybe years later. And then the design of individual buildings will be done over perhaps hundreds of years. So it's really all one thing, and yet it's meant to function as an ensemble, which means that the street designer has to anticipate the future architecture and the building and street relationships. And the fact that we're quite critical of not just of modern architecture, because we both acknowledge and we write about in the book how there's been some spectacular achievements in modern architecture. But we do write about the success ratio of traditional and classical forms and why that success rate is so high and why those forms tend to be enduring and not just out of fashion within a few short years. we write about that in the book. And that is probably a moment where, if you're flipping through it, where a traffic engineer is going to say, wait, this is talking about architecture. I was the one to look at a street design book, and we're saying street design is all of that. And so I think that's the first thing you have to get over. Leon Creer, who actually contributed an essay to the book, we speak about it in a few places, and we show some examples, including Poundbury from Creer's portfolio. He once said, and this is probably a bad paraphrase, that some propositions, once thoroughly tested, turn out to be true. My theory can actually be better than yours. And his example was that after a certain number of tests, you find it works better if you're trying to eat by putting your fork in your mouth instead of trying to put your fork in your ear. And yet the innovators, and sometimes the architects, are often trying to throw out the entire recipe, the entire experience, collected human experience in architecture making, and start from scratch and say, none of the rules apply to me, it's me. And then design that one-off thing, and not necessarily testing it first to see if it's the equivalent of sticking your fork in your ear. Some of that was me, not Creer.
Well, I just wanted to say that we're past the hour mark, and we're going to be posting this video onto the CNU website within 24 hours. I'm going to close with a question. You guys describe in the book a sort of sea change in the way we built streets after World War II. 80 years later, it really hasn't. It's still very difficult to build a good street in America, and recognizing this is a complex problem. I mean, there's so many aspects to it. You describe in the book. I'm going to sort of put you on the spot a little bit and ask, what is the one most important thing we need to do to start building good streets routinely again?
You got to go first, John.
Well, obviously, functional classification, which limits the number of street types, is a very big problem, and that's what's funded by the government. And the catalog in the book is a response to that, saying, if we want good cities and towns, we need more street types.
John has reminded me many times that when it's about design, in design there are a few absolutes. That there are always exceptions to the rules, and there are some things that seem to apply all the time, but few of those. And for every rule of thumb, there is an exception where something actually worked. And so thinking about context is important. I would say that one of those near universal truths, at least in the temperate and tropical and subtropical zones, where there's water to do so, is planting street trees help a lot. Henry Arnold said that street trees are 50% of urban design. I think you might be right. If we just realized that we started with the idea that a street was like an extension of the natural world that comes up to your doorstep, and in many cases, the way to embody that is planting street trees and then planting some more street trees, then everything would start to get better, because from that gateway comes, let's make it walkable. Let's balance the ways of moving around within the city. Let's get the architecture as good as the landscape. Everything flows, and that's the simplest thing. If you're going to do one thing in your town that would be non-controversial, relatively easy to fund, and highly effective, planting the right thing in the right place with a good planting detail, plant more street trees. Because from that will come a whole different appreciation of what a street is. And that's what we try to introduce in the book. Rob, you may know this, but Wiley had a bunch of their catalog purchased by Anthropic, the AI company. In fact, there was a class action suit by a bunch of authors whose work was absorbed into the AI's knowledge base when Anthropic purchased the textbooks. And one of them is ours. And so, well, I have mixed feelings about that, of course, because the computer is probably going to think one size does fit all and that everything is absolute. but also a little hopeful that when somebody types in a question in their favorite program about street design, they're going to get an answer that's in this big fat book. That's a note for today.
In the meantime, I think everybody, the book is Street Design, The Secret to Great Cities and Towns. Urbanists should get it. Traffic engineers should get it. I appreciate you guys being on today and describing so much of what you learned writing this book. So, and I thank everybody who was on this call for being part of this discussion. Again, congratulations, John and Victor. It's a great book, and I really appreciated reading it.
Thank you, Rob.
Have a good day. If I can